The moment Ruth Hayes rode into the dying town of Caldwell Creek with nothing but a saddlebag full of broken promises and a heart full of stubborn hope, she had no idea that the most infuriating, stubborn, and quietly devastating man she would ever meet was already watching her from the shadow of a livery stable doorway. The year was 1878, and the Kansas plains stretched out like a canvas God had forgotten to finish painting. Dust devils spiraled up from the cracked earth, and the sun sat low and merciless in a sky the color of hammered copper. Caldwell Creek had once been a prosperous stop along a cattle trail, but drought and a railroad reroute had bled it nearly dry. Half the storefronts on the main street wore boards over their windows like bandages on wounds that had stopped trying to heal. A water trough outside the general store had cracked down the middle, and what little water it still held shimmered with a heat haze that made everything beyond it look like a dream that had not quite solidified. Ruth pulled her roan mare to a stop in front of that general store and climbed down with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent the better part of 2 months on horseback, traveling from St. Louis. She was 26 years old, brown-haired, with eyes the color of creek water after a good rain, and she had the kind of quiet beauty that men tended to notice only after they had already underestimated her. She wore a practical gray riding dress that had seen better days, and her hat was pulled low against the sun. In her saddlebag was a letter of employment from a man named Gerald Holt, who ran a small ranch outside of Caldwell Creek and had advertised in a St. Louis newspaper for a schoolteacher willing to relocate to the frontier. She had answered that advertisement not because she was particularly adventurous, but because she had no other options left. Her father had died in the spring, leaving behind nothing but debt, and the man she had been promised to had quietly married someone else the moment he discovered the estate was gone. Ruth had packed what little she owned, answered 3 similar advertisements in 3 different western territories, and chosen Caldwell Creek because it was the first to write back. She pushed open the door to the general store, and a bell above the frame gave a weak jingle. The inside was dim and smelled of dried tobacco, lard, and sawdust. A heavy man with a gray beard sat behind the counter reading a crumpled newspaper, and he looked up over the rim of his glasses with the unhurried expression of a man who had given up being surprised by anything. "Help you, miss," he said. "I'm looking for Gerald Holt's ranch," Ruth said. "I was told someone in town could direct me." The heavy man set down his newspaper and scratched his beard. Something shifted in his expression, something careful and reluctant that Ruth did not like the look of. "You the schoolteacher he sent for?" the man asked. "I am. My name is Ruth Hayes." The man, whose name was Burrow according to the painted sign above the door, exhaled slowly and took his glasses off. "Miss Hayes," he said, with the weighted tone of someone about to deliver an unpleasant truth, "Gerald Holt passed on about 3 weeks ago. Heart gave out on him. His brother came up from Texas to settle the estate." Ruth stood very still. The saddlebag over her shoulder suddenly felt like it weighed 40 pounds. She had traveled nearly 1,000 miles. She had spent the last of her money on trail supplies and a night in a boarding house in Wichita. She had no letter from any of the other employers she had written to, and she had told herself that was fine because she already had a position secured. "I see," she said, because she was a person who, when the ground fell out from under her feet, chose dignity over panic, at least in public. "Is there a boarding house in town? I will need a few days to determine my next steps." "Mrs. Ellery takes in boarders," Burrow said, studying her with a look that was more sympathetic than she wanted. "End of the main street, blue shutters. She will not charge you too much." He paused. "You planning to stay, miss? Town could sure use a schoolteacher. There is a handful of families here still. Their children have not had proper lessons in over a year." "I will think on it," Ruth said, though what she was truly thinking was that she had no money to go anywhere else. She led her mare down the dusty main street toward Mrs. Ellery's boarding house, and that was when she first saw Monroe Kendrick properly. He was coming out of the livery stable as she passed it, pulling on leather work gloves with the focused efficiency of a man who had a long list of things to do and did not intend to fall behind on any of them. He was tall, broader in the shoulder than the doorframe comfortably allowed, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same stone as the Flint Hills. He wore a worn canvas shirt, dusty trousers tucked into working boots, and no hat, which was unusual out here and gave him a slightly unfinished quality, like a sentence that had not quite been punctuated. He glanced at her as she passed, one of those assessing, instinctive looks that people on the frontier developed as a matter of survival, taking in her traveling clothes, her horse, the set of her jaw. He did not smile. He did not nod. He simply registered her existence and went back to whatever business occupied his mind. Ruth did not give him a second thought. She had bigger concerns. Mrs. Ellery turned out to be a compact, sharp-eyed woman of about 60 who ran her boarding house with the organized authority of a general running a very clean campaign. She had 2 rooms available and charged 50 cents a night, which Ruth paid, counting out coins from a small leather purse with the careful attention of a woman who knew exactly how many of them she had left. That evening, over a supper of salt pork, cornbread, and strong black coffee, Ruth sat across from the only other boarder, a passing land surveyor named Peters who was on his way south. Mrs. Ellery joined them, and Ruth learned, over the course of that meal, a great deal about Caldwell Creek and a fair amount about Monroe Kendrick without intending to learn either. Monroe, it turned out, was the man who had kept the town from dying entirely. He owned the livery stable and had bought up 2 of the failed businesses on the main street with the intention of turning them into something useful. He ran cattle on a modest spread 2 miles north of town and employed 3 men. He was 31 years old, had come to Kansas from Tennessee 6 years ago, and according to Mrs. Ellery, who delivered this information with the brisk casualness of someone reading from a ledger, he was the most dependable, hardworking, and simultaneously most frustrating individual in the entire county. Frustrating how? Ruth asked, because she was tired and ought to have gone to bed, but the coffee was good, and she was lonely in the way that long travel makes a person. Mrs. Ellery considered the question. He has opinions, she said finally, and he keeps them to himself, which is worse than a man who just says his piece and gets on with it. You never quite know what Monroe Kendrick is thinking, and it makes conversations with him feel like trying to read a book with half the pages torn out. Ruth thought that was an interesting description. She filed it away and forgot about it by morning. She had a town to negotiate with. The following day she presented herself at the small church at the end of the street, which also served, she had been told, as the schoolhouse. The minister, a young man named Reverend Caldwell, whose grandfather had founded the town, and who clearly felt the weight of that legacy every hour of every day, met her there and showed her around. The church was small but solid, built from good limestone, with tall windows that let in the pale morning light. One end held pews and an altar. The other end, separated by a folding wooden partition, was supposed to be the schoolroom. It held 6 rough-hewn benches, a blackboard that had gone gray with years of chalk dust never properly wiped away, and a pot-bellied stove that had a crack in one of its iron sides. How many children? Ruth asked, running her finger along the edge of the blackboard. 7 at present, Reverend Caldwell said, ranging in age from 5 to 13. The families cannot pay much. Some cannot pay anything at all and would offer other means, firewood, food, labor on your behalf. What was Mr. Holt prepared to pay? Ruth asked. Caldwell named a modest sum per month, enough to cover her board at Mrs. Ellery's and leave a little over. It was not comfortable, but it was real, and real was what Ruth needed right now. I will take the position, she said. I would like to start Monday. Caldwell looked so relieved that she felt a small, warm pulse of satisfaction despite everything. It was good to be needed somewhere, even a somewhere you had not intended to land. She spent the rest of that morning cleaning the schoolroom, which had accumulated a winter's worth of grit, and a family of mice who vacated with expressed indignation when she swept them out. She was on her knees scrubbing the wooden floor when she became aware of someone standing in the doorway and looked up to find Monroe Kendrick watching her with his arms crossed and that unreadable expression Mrs. Ellery had described. "You are the schoolteacher Holt sent for," he said. It was not a question. Ruth sat back on her heels and regarded him. Up close, in the bright morning light coming through those tall windows, he was more striking than she had registered yesterday. There was something very settled about him, as if he had decided long ago exactly who he was and had no interest in renegotiating. His eyes were a deep brown with a focused quality that made her feel, for a moment, like the most carefully observed person in the state of Kansas. "Ruth Hayes," she said, "and you are Monroe Kendrick. Mrs. Ellery mentioned you last night." Something shifted minutely at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile but the shadow of one. What did she say? "That you have opinions you keep to yourself," Ruth said pleasantly. "I found it an interesting description." He was quiet for a moment. "When do you plan to start teaching?" "Monday." "I was hoping to get this room into a usable state before then." She gestured around at the buckets and rags and general project she was midway through. Monroe looked at the cracked stove in the corner. "That stove needs replacing before autumn," he said. "It will not keep the room warm enough once the weather turns, and the weather out here turns hard." "I expect it does," Ruth said. "Do you know where I might find a replacement?" "I can get one sent from Wichita," he said. "I have a supply order going out next week." She looked at him more carefully. "That is kind of you." "It is not kindness," he said, with a practicality that was entirely unsentimental. "Children cannot learn when they are cold. It is common sense." "Well," Ruth said, "I appreciate common sense." He nodded once, looked around the room one more time as if filing it away for reference, and left. Ruth watched the empty doorway for a moment and then went back to scrubbing. The days that followed were busy enough to keep her from dwelling too much on how far she was from everything she had known. She opened the school on Monday to 7 faces ranging from little Ida Burrow, who was 5 and brought a rag doll she sat in her lap throughout the lessons, to Thomas Reeves, who was 13, and had the particular sullenness of a boy who believed himself too old to be taught by a woman, but whose mother had given him no choice. Ruth handled Thomas by ignoring his sullenness and asking him, on the second day, to explain to the younger students the arithmetic he had just completed himself. He had not expected to be made useful rather than scolded, and it changed his posture in a way that was quite visible. She settled into a rhythm at Mrs. Ellery's, taking her meals with the small rotating cast of boarders and the landlady, spending her evenings preparing the next day's lessons by the light of a kerosene lamp. She walked the town in the early mornings before school started, learning its geography and its people. Monroe Kendrick she encountered regularly, because Caldwell Creek was small enough that regular encounters with everyone were unavoidable. He was always working. She saw him at the livery, at the building he had bought on the east end of Main Street that he was converting, with the methodical patience of a man who expected the project to take years, into a proper feed and supply store. She saw him riding out to his cattle operation in the mornings, returning in the evenings with the dust of the range still on him. He always acknowledged her, a nod, sometimes a word or two. He was never unfriendly, but he maintained a certain distance that felt less like coldness and more like a boundary he had drawn around himself long ago for reasons she did not know and was not sure she should be curious about. The new stove arrived with his supply order in late September, and he installed it himself, fitting the iron sections together with careful, unhurried competence, while Ruth moved the children's benches out of his way and tried not to notice the way he worked, which was quiet and thorough and utterly without showmanship. "You did not have to do this yourself," she said when he was done, as he gathered his tools. "Easier than explaining to someone else how to fit the flue," he said. He straightened up and tested the damper once, twice, nodded to himself. "That should hold the heat well enough. You will want to keep good dry wood in here." I will have a cord split and stacked outside before the cold comes." "Monroe," she said, and using his first name felt like a small act of boldness she had not quite planned. He looked at her. "Thank you, genuinely." He held her gaze for a moment with an expression she could not translate, then dipped his head in acknowledgement and walked out. She told herself she was not thinking about him any more than was reasonable for someone she encountered frequently. She was mostly convincing. October arrived, and with it a slower pace as the cattle drives wound down for the season, and the ranchers and cowboys who had passed through in summer settled into their winter operations. The town felt more inhabited in a way, the people who remained hunkered down rather than passing through. There were small social events, a church supper, a gathering at the Reeves house for someone's birthday, and Ruth attended them all because she understood that her effectiveness as a teacher depended partly on her standing in the community, and her standing in the community depended on being present and personable. Monroe appeared at these events like a reluctant fixture, present because his absence would have been noted, and he seemed to have a sense of civic obligation that he found genuinely uncomfortable but refused to abdicate. At the church supper, Ruth found herself seated near him by the accident of arrangement, and they talked for the first time at any real length. He asked about her lessons, which surprised her, because she had not expected him to have been paying attention. She told him about the curriculum she was building, about Thomas Reeves, about little Ida who had progressed from knowing 4 letters to 12 in less than a month, and greeted this achievement with the solemn pride of a small general taking a city. Monroe listened. That was what she noticed most. He was a very complete listener, the kind of person who did not use your talking time to formulate his own next sentence, but actually absorbed what you were saying. When he spoke, it was responsive to what she had said rather than adjacent to it. She found herself telling him about St. Louis, about her father, about the life she had left. She had not intended to go that far into it, but the evening was warm and the coffee was good, and he was easier to talk to than she had anticipated, precisely because he made so little demand on the conversation. "Why did you stay?" she asked him at some point. "Here, I mean." When the railroad rerouted and things went difficult, most people left. He thought about this with the genuine consideration he seemed to bring to everything. "I had put work into this place," he said. "I do not like to leave things half done." "That is all," she said. "Some places take hold of you," he said. "The sky here is like nothing I had seen before, and the people who stayed are people worth staying for." He paused. "Besides, someone needs to keep the roof from caving in on this town, sometimes literally." Ruth laughed, which seemed to surprise him. A real laugh, the unguarded kind she had not produced in a while. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was starting to be able to read slightly better, a careful warmth, like a fire in a room that has been cold for a long time. November brought a hard frost, and with it the first real test of the new stove, which performed magnificently. Ruth wore her heavier dress to school, and the children arrived bundled in coats and scarves and unwound themselves like small parcels being opened. She had by now established not just lessons but a genuine routine that the children seemed to look forward to. And this was the part of the work that gave her the most satisfaction, the sense that these small minds were not just being filled with facts but genuinely sparked. She was walking home from school one late November afternoon when she rounded the corner of the livery and nearly collided with Monroe, who was moving in the other direction carrying 2 heavy feed sacks over his shoulders. He stopped with the reflexive steadiness of a man who was difficult to knock off balance, and she stepped back with a startled "oh," and they stood for a moment a foot apart, each taking stock of the other. "You all right?" he asked. "Fine," she said. "Sorry, I was not watching." "Neither was I," he said, which coming from someone who always seemed to be watching everything was charming in its unexpectedness. He shifted the weight of the sacks. "You are out late." "I stayed to finish grading the children's reading exercises," she said. The sky had gone the dark copper color of sunset, and the cold had real teeth now. Her breath made small clouds. "Walk with you to Ellery's," he said. was offered so simply that she answered simply in return. "All right." He set the feed sacks just inside the livery doors and fell into step beside her. The main street was quiet in the early dark, a lantern burning in Burroughs' store window, a horse tied outside the saloon at the far end of the street. They walked without speaking for a moment, and Ruth noticed that the silence with Monroe Kendrick was not uncomfortable the way silence with some people was. It had a quality of companionability to it. "How is the supply store coming along?" she asked, because she had walked past his project that morning, and it looked as though significant progress had been made. "Should be able to open it in the spring," he said. "There is a family in Wichita I have been corresponding with. They have experience in dry goods. I'm hoping to bring them out to run the day-to-day operation." "You are building this town back up," she said. It was an observation, not flattery. He was quiet for a moment. "Someone should." "You could have gone somewhere that did not need building," she said. "Somewhere already built. Easier." "I expect that is true," he said, and left it there, which meant he had thought about it and arrived at a conclusion he saw no need to explain because it was evident in his choices. They reached Mrs. Ellery's blue-shuttered door, and Ruth stopped at the porch step. She turned to look at him. In the fading light, with the cold air and the quiet street around them, he was very present, very solid, like something the landscape had decided to keep. "Thank you for the company," she said. "Good night, Miss Hayes," he said. She went inside and stood in the hallway for a moment, aware of a warmth that had nothing to do with the house stove. She did not tell herself anything in particular about it, but she was aware of it. December settled over Caldwell Creek like a heavy quilt, muffled in white. The first snowfall came in the second week and transformed the rutted Main Street into something briefly and convincingly beautiful. The children arrived at school the next morning in a state of barely contained ecstasy, and Ruth made the executive decision to spend the first half hour observing the snowfall through the tall windows and having each child describe it aloud in a complete sentence, which was both a language lesson and, she suspected, exactly what they needed. The Christmas preparations were modest by city standards and lavish by frontier ones. Mrs. Ellery made a fruitcake from a recipe that had apparently survived a covered wagon crossing. The church was decorated with boughs of cedar, and there was a small community gathering planned for Christmas Eve. Ruth had been asked to lead the children in a recitation of a poem she had been teaching them, and she spent a good part of her evenings helping each of them memorize their assigned lines. She and Monroe had fallen into a pattern by now that neither of them had explicitly arranged. He walked her home from school on the evenings he happened to be in town when she left, which was most evenings. They talked about the town, about the children's progress, about the books she had with her, and the newspapers that arrived 2 weeks late from Wichita. He had read widely, she discovered, in the practical autodidact way of a man who had educated himself in off-seasons and winter evenings, and he had opinions about what he had read that were always surprising because they came from directions she had not expected. He had read Mary Shelley. He said he thought Frankenstein was less a story about a monster and more a story about the consequences of creation without responsibility, and that the monster's tragedy was that he had been given consciousness without being given any context for it. Ruth had stared at him. "That is exactly right," she said, "and I have never heard anyone put it that way." He looked faintly pleased and then carefully unrevealing about being pleased, which she found absolutely maddening in the best possible way. She liked him. She had been trying to be honest with herself about this for some weeks now. It was not the breathless infatuation she had experienced as a younger woman, which had attached itself to the wrong person entirely, but something steadier and more unnerving, a recognition, the particular feeling of encountering someone who was genuinely interesting to you, not just pleasant or attractive but interesting, the kind of person whose opinion on a thing you found yourself curious about before you even knew what the thing was. The Christmas Eve gathering was held in the church, the partition pulled close to make the chapel portion intimate and warm. Ruth watched Monroe from across the room as the children finished their recitation to genuine applause, and she saw something on his face that she did not expect, an openly warm expression, unguarded for once, watching the children take their small bows with the unself-conscious pride of people who have done something real. He caught her watching him and held her gaze for a moment. He did not look away, and neither did she. The fire in the hearth crackled. Ida Burrow skipped past between them with her rag doll. The moment passed, but it left something changed in its wake, like a door that had opened slightly and would not go entirely closed again. On Christmas Day, Ruth ate dinner with Mrs. Ellery and 2 other boarders, and tried not to feel the particular weight of holidays spent among kind strangers. She had written to a cousin in St. Louis, and received a short letter in return, full of news about people she no longer knew and a life that already felt like a coat she had outgrown. In the afternoon, there was a knock at Mrs. Ellery's front door. Mrs. Ellery answered it and called Ruth from her room with a tone that suggested she knew exactly what she was doing. Ruth came downstairs to find Monroe at the door, hat in hand, holding a small package wrapped in brown paper. He looked, for the first time she had seen, slightly uncertain. "Merry Christmas," he said. "I thought you might want something to read. You mentioned you had finished the books you brought with you." She took the package and opened it carefully. It was a copy of George Eliot's Middlemarch, which she had never read, the pages clean and uncracked, new. She looked up at him. "Where did you find this in Caldwell Creek?" "I did not," he said. "I ordered it with the last supply order. It arrived last week. I was going to give it to you when we finished building the library shelf I promised Reverend Caldwell, but I decided Christmas was better." Ruth felt something in her chest do something complicated. She managed to say, evenly, "This is a very thoughtful gift, Monroe. Thank you." "I know you miss having books," he said. It was said plainly, as an observation of something he had noticed and cared about, and it undid her far more than any elaborate gesture could have. "Would you like to come in?" she asked. "Mrs. Ellery has made enough Christmas cake to feed the whole county." And so Monroe Kendrick came in for Christmas cake and stayed for 3 hours, sitting at Mrs. Ellery's dining table while the landlady graciously found reasons to be elsewhere most of the time, and the fire burned down slowly, and outside the snow fell again, soft and white, and covering everything in a temporary perfection. They talked about everything and nothing. They talked about Tennessee, which he described with the spare affection of someone who loved a place without being willing to be owned by it. They talked about what Ruth had imagined the West would be before she arrived, and what it turned out to actually be, which was harder and stranger and more beautiful than any illustration in a newspaper could convey. They talked about what Caldwell Creek might be in 5 years if the supply store opened, and the school kept running, and someone convinced the railroad to at least run a spur line through. "You sound like you intend to be here in 5 years, Monroe said. Ruth considered this. She had not planned to. She had planned, in the foggy way of someone without a real plan, to evaluate her options when something more concrete presented itself. But sitting here in this warm room with this particular quiet man, the idea of being somewhere else in 5 years felt, for the first time, less appealing than the alternative. "I might be," she said. "I am starting to like it here." He looked at her steadily, the way he always did, that unhurried, focused attention. "I am glad," he said, and meant it with a simplicity that was entirely unstrategic. January was brutal in the way that Kansas January could be, the kind of cold that came with wind that turned the cold into something personal and aggressive. School attendance dropped on the worst days, and Ruth took to visiting the children who lived in town on those afternoons, sitting in their families' kitchens and working through lessons over cups of hot tea. On one such afternoon, she was returning from the Reeves house when the wind picked up sharply, and the temperature dropped so fast she could feel it change between one step and the next. The sky had gone the particular yellow-gray color that meant serious weather was coming, and it was coming fast. She was still 3 blocks from Mrs. Ellery's when the full blizzard hit. The wind came up like a wall, driving snow horizontally, and within moments the visibility was near zero. Ruth pulled her coat tighter and bent her head and kept walking. But the street that she knew perfectly well in good weather was suddenly entirely disorienting in the white screaming chaos of the storm. She was aware she had walked too far in one direction when she did not find Mrs. Ellery's porch where she expected it. She stopped, turned, and a gust hit her hard enough to make her stagger. A hand caught her arm, a firm, immediate grip. "This way," Monroe said loudly over the wind, and she could barely see him, but she could feel the certainty in his grip, and she went with it. He kept hold of her arm and moved with the steady purposefulness of a man who knew this particular piece of ground in every condition, and 2 minutes later a door opened ahead of them, and they were inside the livery stable, out of the wind. The horses moved and shifted in their stalls, uneasy from the storm. Ruth stood in the relative warmth of the stable and breathed, her heartbeat slowly returning to something normal. The lantern hanging from a center beam swung slightly from the wind that had come in with them. "You were heading south instead of east," Monroe said. He had not let go of her arm yet. He seemed to realize this and released it. "It is impossible to see anything out there," Ruth said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "It will ease in an hour or so," he said. "These come up fast and they pass fast. Stay until it does." She nodded. He brought a horse blanket from a shelf and held it out to her, and she draped it around her shoulders without argument. He had a small wood stove in the corner of the stable office, a low-ceilinged room separated from the main stable by a half-wall, and he built it up until the heat was real and substantial. They sat on upturned crates in that small warm space while the storm howled outside and the horses settled into their nighttime quiet. And it was the strangest and most intimate circumstance Ruth had been in since arriving in Caldwell Creek, the two of them encircled by the storm, the lamplight warm and unsteady, the world reduced to this small wooden room and each other. "Were you worried about me?" she asked, because she was curious and because they had known each other long enough now that she could ask direct questions. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "You were watching for me to come back," she said. "I had been watching the sky," he said. "I was coming to find you when you turned the wrong direction." She looked at him. He was looking at the stove. There was a set to his jaw that she recognized now as the expression he wore when he was feeling something he was uncertain about sharing. "Monroe," she said softly, "you can say what you are thinking." He looked at her then, and for the first time since she had met him, the careful distance was entirely absent. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they have been trying not to look at directly for a long time. "I think about you," he said, "more than is probably wise." He said it simply, the way he said everything, without embellishment or apology. "I have been thinking about you since September, and I have been telling myself it is not the right time to say so, or it is not the right circumstances, or some other reason. But I was standing in my livery watching that sky turn and thinking about where you were, and I think I am done waiting for the right time." Ruth felt the warmth move through her that had nothing to do with the stove. She breathed. "I think about you too," she said. "Since the stove, since that walk in November, since Christmas. I think about what you think about things, and I think about what you would say, and I look for you when I come into the main street in the mornings." She paused, which I was also telling myself was not particularly wise. He looked at her for a long moment with that focused, complete attention, and then, carefully, he reached across the short space between the two upturned crates and took her hand. His hand was large and roughened from work and very warm, and he held hers with a gentleness that was absolutely at odds with how physically substantial he was, the way you hold something you value and do not wish to break. Ruth looked down at their joined hands and then up at his face, and she felt something shift conclusively inside her, some final resolution of a question she had been turning over for months. "I should tell you," he said, "that I am not a man who says things I do not mean, and I am not a man who does things halfway. If you are willing to consider this, you should know that I am entirely serious." "I would not want you to be anything other than that," she said. Outside, the blizzard was still howling. Inside the small stable office, The stove burned warm and steady, and Monroe Kendrick held Ruth Hayes' hand and they talked until the storm passed, which it did, as he had promised, an hour or so later, leaving the world outside white and still and completely transformed. He walked her to Mrs. Ellery's after, through the deep new snow, and at the porch he said good night with a formality that was somehow more intimate than anything less formal would have been, because it was him being careful with something he had decided was worth being careful with. Mrs. Ellery, who opened the door herself and had clearly been watching for Ruth's return, looked at the two of them on the porch and said absolutely nothing, but the expression on her face was one of profound, satisfied correctness. The winter moved differently after that. There was a particular quality to the light on ordinary days, and an awareness in Ruth that she carried through her lessons and her evenings and her mornings, a warm attentiveness to the world that she had not felt for a very long time. Monroe courted her in the direct, unhurried way he did everything. He called on her at Mrs. Ellery's on Sunday afternoons, the appropriate and agreed-upon time. He took her riding on the days when the weather permitted, showing her the land he knew, the rolling brown grass and the creek beds, and the particular way the horizon looked from the low ridge north of town. He brought her books when he could get them, and they discussed them in a genuine back-and-forth that Ruth found more nourishing than any social event she had ever attended. He showed her his cattle operation, introducing her to his 3 hands with the easy directness of a man who was not making a pretension of anything. The hands, 2 brothers named Frank and Del Harlow, and an older cowboy named Soto, who had ridden cattle trails for 20 years, and had the permanently squinted eyes of a man who had spent decades reading the range, were respectful and plainly curious. Soto tipped his hat and called her Miss Hayes and went back to his work, but she caught him watching Monroe with an expression of quiet approval later, which pleased her for reasons she could not have entirely explained. February brought a brief thaw, and with it a sense of possibility, the feeling that the winter was not, in fact, permanent. Ruth opened the schoolroom windows for an afternoon, and the children were revived by the outside air in a way that made their afternoon reading lesson considerably more energetic. She and Monroe had by now established, without any formal discussion, a shared understanding of where they were heading. It was not yet spoken in explicit terms, but it was present in everything, in the way he looked at her, in the way she looked forward to his company with a happiness that was entirely genuine, in the small adjustments of 2 people beginning, unconsciously, to organize their lives with an awareness of the other person's place in them. He told her about Tennessee one evening in late February, not just the landscape but the family, a father who had worked a farm too hard for too little return, a mother who had been brilliant and exhausted, a younger sister who had married and settled in Memphis. He had come west at 25 because the farm was his older brother's by inheritance and Tennessee had nothing left in it that required him specifically, and he had wanted to build something that was his, something he had chosen rather than been assigned. Ruth told him about her father, about the slow, sad decline of a man who had once been capable, and how difficult it was to watch capability erode. She told him about the man who had been promised to her, and who had promptly unromanced himself the moment the money disappeared, which she had come to see as a considerable service he had done her, though it had not felt that way at the time. Monroe listened to this with the particular stillness he brought to things he found significant. His loss, he said. It was 3 words. They were 3 of the most straightforwardly kind words anyone had said to her in years, and she felt them land squarely. "I think so too now," she said. "I think coming here was the best thing I could have done, even though I did not choose it so much as run out of other options." "Sometimes that is how the best decisions get made," Monroe said. March arrived with wind and mud, and the particular chaos of a landscape reorganizing itself after winter. The supply store Monroe had been building for a year opened in the first week of March, stocked and staffed by the Granville family from Wichita, who arrived in 2 wagons with a teenage son named Percy, who immediately fell into a state of complicated fascination with Thomas Reeves that resulted in both of them being model students, each apparently trying to impress the other. The store's opening brought a small celebration, which Caldwell Creek conducted with the enthusiasm of a community that had not had enough good news recently. There was food and a fiddle player, and the main street was crowded in a way it had not been since Ruth arrived. She watched Monroe stand in front of the new storefront and speak to his neighbors with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has watched something he worked for become real, and she felt a pride in him that surprised her with its depth. He danced with her that night, one of the few times she had seen him allow himself to be visibly unconstrained. He was not a natural dancer, but he was controlled and attentive, and she discovered that being that close to him, his hand at her waist and her hand in his, was something she had been wanting without quite admitting it. "You look happy," she told him. "I am," he said simply. She thought about how much she liked the simplicity with which he said true things. April was when he asked her. She had known it was coming in the way you sometimes know things before they happen, not from any explicit signal, but from the accumulation of smaller understandings. She knew from the way he had spoken to her about the future in recent weeks, including her in it as a matter of assumed fact. She knew from the way he looked at her across the room at the Granville store opening. She knew from the particular gravity in his manner on the April morning when he came to the boarding house and asked if she would like to ride out to the ridge with him. They rode north in the early morning light, the prairie opening around them with the extraordinary lushness of a Kansas spring, the grass unbelievably green and the wildflowers scattered across it in improbable profusion. She had thought last October that this landscape was beautiful in its austerity. She had not been prepared for it in bloom. They tied the horses at the bottom of the ridge and walked up, and from the top the land spread out in every direction to the edges of vision, curved gently by the earth's own curvature, and the sky above was enormous and clear, and the particular deep blue of an April morning that has decided to be definitive. Monroe turned to her. He had been quiet on the ride, not uncomfortably so, but with the gathered quality of a man organizing himself for something important. "I have been thinking about how to say this in a way that does justice to what I feel," he said, "and I have come to the conclusion that I do not have that kind of language. So I am going to say it plainly and trust that you understand the plainness is not an absence of depth." Ruth looked at him. "I trust that entirely," she said. "I love you," he said. "I have been in love with you since approximately November, and I have spent the winter trying to be sure it was real and not just the particular loneliness of a Kansas winter, and I am sure. I would like to marry you if you are willing." He paused. "I have a house that is not yet what it should be, and a ranch that needs more work than I can finish in the years I have left to work it, and a town I am committed to for the duration. I cannot offer you the life you might have had in St. Louis. But I can offer you everything I am and everything I intend to build, and I can promise you that those things are considerable." Ruth stood on that ridge in the spring air with her heart doing something enormous and entirely appropriate to the moment, and she thought about how she had arrived in Caldwell Creek without options and found something better than anything she had planned. She thought about 7 children whose lives were expanding because she was there. She thought about a man who had ordered a book for her before he said he loved her, who had come into the storm to find her, who listened with his whole self and said true things simply and built lasting things with his hands. "Yes," she said. "Monroe, yes, I love you too. I have loved you since you told me what Frankenstein was actually about, and I have been very impatient with myself about it ever since." He laughed, and it was the fullest laugh she had ever heard from him, unguarded and real, and it was the best sound she had heard in a very long time. He pulled her toward him with a care that held nothing back, and she went, and they stood together on that ridge in the April morning while the Kansas plains spread out infinite and green below them, and she thought that she understood now why he had stayed when everything else left. Some places take hold of you. They were married in the first week of June, in the limestone church where Ruth taught school 5 days a week, by Reverend Caldwell, who performed the ceremony with a visible emotion that he was clearly fighting to maintain professional dignity about. The church was full. Every family in Caldwell Creek was there. The Burrows and the Reeves and the Granvilles and a dozen others Ruth had come to know over the course of her year in this town. Mrs. Ellery wore her best dress and sat in the front pew with an expression of fierce satisfaction. The Harlow brothers, Frank and Dell, arrived in clean shirts and slicked hair and sat together looking scrubbed and attentive. Old Soto sat at the back and said nothing, but he stayed for the entire reception, which Ruth suspected was his version of a standing ovation. Ruth wore a dress she had made with Mrs. Ellery's help, ivory cotton with small embroidered flowers at the collar, and she walked down the aisle with Reverend Caldwell officiating at the far end and Monroe standing at the altar with the expression of a man who was looking at something he had not known he was missing until it was directly in front of him. They exchanged their vows in the traditional form, but Monroe had asked her beforehand if he could add one line, and she had said yes, and so after the formal words he said, quiet and direct, "I will be here, whatever the weather." She had known what he meant. She suspected everyone in the church knew what he meant. The wind outside was behaving itself, and the light through the tall limestone windows was exactly the color of the morning on the ridge in April. The summer that followed was the happiest Ruth had experienced in her adult memory, the kind of happiness that is not loud or showy, but runs through everything like water through good soil. She kept her school, which Monroe had never suggested she leave, and which she would not have left in any case. She moved into his house on the edge of town, a solid stone and timber structure he had built himself 5 years ago, and which she set about making into something warmer than a bachelor's practical shelter, adding curtains and books and a kitchen garden and a small vegetable patch that she learned to tend with the earnest experimentation of a city-born woman, discovering for the first time what food looks like before it arrives at a market. Monroe watched her learn these things with a quiet delight that he expressed in characteristic fashion, by being there, by helping without taking over, by the particular way he looked at her that she had come to understand was his most eloquent form of communication. His ranch grew. The Granville store brought new traffic to Caldwell Creek, which began, tentatively, to recover some of its former vitality. 2 new families arrived over the summer, drawn by the reputation of the school and the store, and they were exactly the kind of families that a frontier town needed, hardworking, practical, committed. Ruth gained 2 new students, a girl of 8 named Margaret who was fierce and brilliant, and a boy of 6 named Joseph who was gentle and very kind, and who adopted little Ida Burrow as his particular school friend with an earnestness that made Ruth quietly emotional. In September, exactly 1 year after she had ridden into Caldwell Creek with a broken contract and the remains of her savings, Ruth realized she was expecting their first child. She told Monroe on a Tuesday evening after supper, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the first cool breath of autumn coming through the open window. He went very still in the way he went still when something had hit him at his foundation. Then he looked at her with an expression that dismantled every last barrier he had, pure and open and overwhelmed with joy. He reached across the table and took both her hands. "Ruth," he said, and then could not immediately continue, which was such an unusual circumstance for a man who chose his words carefully that it said everything. "I know," she said. "Are you well?" "Are you? I am perfectly well," she said. "I am happy." "Good," he said, and the word carried the weight of a much longer declaration. They told Mrs. Ellery the following morning, and the old woman pulled Ruth into a brisk, fierce hug, and told Monroe that he had better make sure the house was warm enough before March, which was the most practical and affectionate thing she could have said. The autumn of 1879 was the most alive season Ruth had experienced. She taught her lessons with an energy that seemed to infect her students, all 9 of them now, and she came home each evening to a house that felt more like a home every week, the kitchen garden giving its last harvest, the firewood stacked along the south wall by Monroe's own hands, the house warm and solid around her. Monroe had become something she had not known to want, a partner who took her seriously, who asked her opinion on decisions, and actually changed his mind when her opinion was better than his initial plan, which happened more often than his masculine frontier pride would probably have wished, but which he acknowledged without grudge, because he genuinely cared about getting things right more than he cared about being right. She loved him more each month. This was not a thing she had expected. Having grown up on stories that implied love was a fixed quantity established at the beginning and then maintained or lost. She had not expected it to grow, to deepen, to acquire new dimensions as you learned more about a person and found each new thing as interesting as the last. She had not expected to fall in love with Monroe Kendrick repeatedly, in different ways, as the seasons changed and the circumstances changed and new facets of him were revealed by ordinary life. She fell in love with him again the day she watched him negotiate a trade dispute between two neighboring ranchers with such even-handed, clearly reasoned fairness that both men left the conversation satisfied, which was a thing she would have previously considered impossible. She fell in love with him again the Sunday morning he sat in their kitchen reading to her from the newspaper when she was too tired to hold it herself. She fell in love with him again every time he came home in the evenings, and the first thing he did was find her, not the horses or the accounts or the 10 things that needed doing, but her, just to know she was there. There were difficulties, as there are in any real life. A hard winter storm in February collapsed part of the fence on Monroe's north pasture, and 20 head of cattle wandered into the neighboring property, and created a situation that took 2 weeks and considerable diplomatic skill to resolve. Ruth's second winter was harder physically than her first had been, the pregnancy advancing through the coldest months and her energy lower than she was accustomed to. She taught her lessons from a chair when standing became less comfortable, and her students, who had all worked out what was happening, treated her with an endearing protective care. Thomas Reeves carried her books. Ida Burrow brought her wildflowers when they bloomed through the snow cracks in early March. Young Percy Granville, who had grown considerably since his family's arrival, shoveled the path between the church and the main road without being asked, and Ruth saw him do it 3 mornings in a row before she managed to catch him and thank him properly. In March of 1880, on a morning when the sky was beginning to show the first pale promise of spring, and the cottonwoods along the creek were showing the first faint green of new leaves, their son was born. Monroe was there, because the frontier did not afford the luxury of any other arrangement, and because he would not have been anywhere else in any case. The doctor who served the region, a competent and reassuringly unflappable man named Dr. Peake, who covered a 3-county area on horseback, arrived in time and managed the birth with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this work in far less favorable circumstances. Their son arrived in the early afternoon, healthy and considerably vocal in his opinions about having been arrived. Monroe held him with the particular reverent care that large, strong men sometimes display with very small new things, as if their own physical strength has suddenly become a responsibility they want to be absolutely certain they are handling correctly. He looked at his son and then at Ruth with an expression that she thought she would never stop seeing when she closed her eyes, a man looking at the fullness of his own life. "Henry," Ruth said, because they had agreed on names and Henry was the one that had felt right since December. "Henry," Monroe repeated, tasting the name. He looked at her. "You did an extraordinary thing today." "We did," she said. "I was significantly less useful than you," he said. "You were exactly useful enough," she told him, which was true. Henry Kendrick was a vigorous and opinionated child from the beginning, with his father's dark hair and his mother's creekwater eyes, and a temperament that appeared to be entirely his own, curious and determined, and very interested in the world. He disrupted Ruth's sleep patterns for 4 months and reorganized every routine in the household with the absolute authority of a person who weighs 9 pounds and has very clear needs. Ruth returned to teaching in May, bringing Henry to school in a basket for the first month until he was old enough to be left with Mrs. Ellery, who had offered this service with a fervor that suggested she had been waiting for the opportunity. Her students treated Henry with the elaborate solemnity of young people who have been given a responsibility they take very seriously, and little Ida in particular developed a possessive tenderness toward him that Ruth found the most charming thing she had ever observed in a classroom. Caldwell Creek changed further over 1880. The railroad, responding to the increased commerce that Monroe's supply store and the school and the accumulated determination of the remaining residents had brought, agreed to lay a spur line through the town. It was announced in the summer, and the effect on the community was electric. 3 new families arrived before the year was out. A doctor set up a proper practice when Dr. Peake, aging and tired, decided to reduce his territory. A second mercantile opened on the south end of the main street. There was talk of a proper hotel. Monroe watched all of this with the satisfaction of a man who had planted seeds in ground that people told him was too dry to grow anything, and was now watching the harvest come in. He expanded his ranch operation, adding to his herd and hiring 2 more hands, and began working on an addition to the house that would give Henry a proper room and leave space for whatever came next. Ruth taught 12 students that fall, the largest class she had had. She was given a proper salary increase when the town council, which had begun meeting monthly with Monroe as one of its members, voted to allocate a larger portion of the community fund to education. She used part of it to order proper textbooks, which arrived on the new spur line in November in a crate that the children greeted like Christmas. Monroe came home one evening in the late autumn of 1880 carrying a length of fabric that he set on the kitchen table with the slight self-consciousness of someone who has done something they consider slightly outside their customary range. Mrs. Granville said the color was right, he said. For curtains, she said, for the new room. Ruth unfolded it. It was a warm amber cotton, the exact color of afternoon light in October. It is perfect, she said. Good, he said with his characteristic simplicity, and went to see to the horses, and she stood in the kitchen holding amber fabric and feeling a happiness so complete and so specific to this life, this place, this man, that it did not require examination or qualification. It simply was. The winter of 1880 to 1881 was cold but not brutal, and their household found a settled rhythm, the kind that develops when 2 people have been living together long enough that their habits have stopped being negotiations and become a shared language. Ruth made her morning coffee strong, and Monroe drank it without comment, having abandoned the weaker version he had preferred before her arrival with the quiet adaptability he brought to anything he had decided was a fixed point. Monroe always banked the kitchen stove before bed, even when Ruth had already done it, checking it with the systematic certainty of a man who does not take warmth for granted. They read in the evenings, sometimes aloud to each other, sometimes separately in the same room, Henry asleep in his new amber-curtained room with the particular heavy abandon of a baby who has exhausted himself with the labor of growing. Ruth was expecting their second child by spring of 1881, and this time the pregnancy felt familiar and less alarming, the territory of it known. She taught through it with even more confidence than the first time, and her students, the veteran ones who had been through this before, conducted themselves with the air of very experienced professionals. The spring of 1881 brought the railroad's first full service through Caldwell Creek, and the day the first train pulled into the new station was something the whole town turned out for. It was a genuinely extraordinary thing to stand on that flat Kansas ground and watch a locomotive come in from the east, carrying goods and mail and people and the outside world with it. Ruth stood beside Monroe in the crowd, Henry on his father's shoulders with both small fists wrapped in his father's hair, and watched the train come in and felt the town shift under her feet into a new era. "Well," Monroe said. "Well," Ruth agreed, which was the most they needed to say. Their daughter was born in August of 1881, arriving with considerably less drama than Henry, and with an immediate self-possession that suggested she had opinions and was already organizing them. They named her Clara, and she had Ruth's coloring, and what Monroe said was his mother's expression, a look of clear-eyed assessment directed at whoever was holding her that suggested she was reserving judgment. Henry, at 17 months, encountered his sister with the initial wariness of a person who has been the center of things and has just received information that this may be subject to renegotiation. Within a week he had decided she was satisfactory and began carrying things to her with the gravity of a small person performing an important duty. Ruth watched her children and felt the particular fullness of a life that had been rebuilt from the ground and built correctly the second time. She thought sometimes about the woman who had ridden into Caldwell Creek 2.5 years ago, tired and broke and stubbornly refusing to show it, and she felt a tenderness toward that version of herself, the same tenderness she felt toward her students when they were struggling with something hard but were too proud to ask for help. She had been struggling. She had landed in exactly the right place. The summer of 1882 brought a challenge that the town had not anticipated. A land speculation company from out of Chicago, which had been buying up failed properties across the Kansas Territory, sent a representative to Caldwell Creek with an aggressive offer to purchase the town's remaining undeveloped lots and the grazing rights to several thousand acres surrounding the area. The offer was superficially attractive and deeply concerning to anyone who understood its implications, which included Monroe, who sat at the town council meeting where it was presented with the focused stillness of a man reading something very carefully. He said nothing during the presentation. He asked to see the documents. He spent 2 days reading them and writing letters to a lawyer in Wichita and a land commissioner he knew professionally. Then he came back to the council with a clear and thorough explanation of what the acquisition would actually mean, which was that the town's access to water rights along the creek would effectively be controlled by a company in Chicago that had no investment in the community's survival. "They are not buying land," he said at the second council meeting, with the quiet authority of a man who has done his work. "They are buying leverage. Once they hold these rights, every rancher and farmer in a 20-mile radius pays whatever they decide to charge or moves on." The council voted to decline the acquisition. The representative from Chicago left with the displeasure of someone unaccustomed to being declined, and Caldwell Creek watched him go without too much anxiety, because they had what they needed: good land, a good school, a working railroad connection, and enough people who had decided this place was worth the investment of their lives. Monroe came home from that second council meeting and sat down at the kitchen table where Ruth was grading papers, and she looked at his face and read the outcome in it before he said a word. "They voted no," she said. 14-2, he said. "Who was the 2?" she asked. "Burroughs' nephew, who arrived last year and does not quite understand yet what took the rest of us years to build here, and a man on the south edge of the county who has been struggling and was attracted by the cash." Monroe paused. "I have plans to go see that second man tomorrow. His cattle operation has been losing efficiency because his water access is poor. I think I can help with that." Ruth looked at him. "You are going to help the man who voted against you." "I am going to help a neighbor who is struggling," Monroe said. "How he voted is separate." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "You are a good man, Monroe Kendrick," she said. He looked at her with that expression she loved, the one that was embarrassed by compliments not because he doubted them but because they moved him, and he did not like to be moved in front of people. She did not count as people in that sense. She counted as home. By the autumn of 1882, Caldwell Creek had 16 families. The school had 15 students, and Ruth was beginning to discuss with the town council the possibility of a proper separate schoolhouse. Given that the church had grown in its religious attendance as the community grew, and the shared space was becoming genuinely inconvenient for both purposes. Monroe quietly drew up plans for the new building over the winter, consulting with Ruth on the interior layout with a thoroughness that resulted in a schoolhouse design that was better thought out than anything a professional architect unfamiliar with the specific needs of frontier teaching would have produced. The schoolhouse was built the following spring, a community effort with every able-bodied person in Caldwell Creek contributing labor in some form. It went up in 6 weeks, solid limestone and good timber, with 3 tall windows on each side and a proper cloakroom, and a teacher's desk that Monroe made himself from walnut wood, exactly the right height for Ruth's particular measurements, which he had taken without telling her why one evening in a way that she had found suspicious, and then extraordinary. The morning Ruth stood in the new schoolhouse for the first time, alone before the students arrived, running her hands along the edge of the walnut desk and looking at the clean blackboard and the good stove installed in the corner. She felt something that had nothing to do with the building itself and everything to do with the accumulated meaning of this place and these years. She had come here by accident and stayed by choice. She had built a life that was genuinely hers, made of work she believed in, and a love that had surprised her with its solidity and its depth, and children who were becoming themselves in daily increments of discovery, and a community that she was part of in ways that were not decorative but structural. When Monroe appeared in the schoolhouse doorway a few minutes before the students were due, as she had expected he would, because he always found reasons to be somewhere near anything important, she turned to look at him and felt it again, that simple, full happiness, the particular version of it that belonged to this man who had been here when she arrived and who had chosen her with the same deliberate conviction he brought to everything worth doing. "How does it look?" he asked. "It looks exactly right," she said. He came in and stood beside her, looking at the room with the eye of a builder who knows where every beam is seated. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him. The way she had learned was both simple and completely sufficient. "Did I tell you," he said, "that Reverend Caldwell mentioned this morning that the Millers are moving out from Wichita next month? He says they have 4 children. 4, Ruth said, making the calculation. "That will bring us to 19 students. You will need more benches," he said. "You will make them," she said, with the confidence of someone who knows that thing to be entirely true. "I will make them," he agreed. The students began to arrive, their voices coming ahead of them up the street, and Ruth straightened, that professional transformation she had perfected over 5 years of teaching on the frontier, the shift from woman to teacher, which was not a division of herself but an expansion of it. Monroe stepped back toward the door. "I will pick up Henry from Mrs. Ellery's this afternoon," he said. "Clara is already there." "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He was almost at the door when she said his name, and he turned. "I love you," she said, plainly and without preamble, because she had learned from him that the best things were said simply. His expression did what it always did when she said that complicated warmth, the brief unguarding of something that was usually more carefully kept. "I love you too," he said. "Go teach." She laughed and turned to greet Thomas Reeves, who at 16 was now her oldest student and the one she most often asked to help the younger children, a role he had grown into with a seriousness that would make him an excellent teacher himself one day, though he did not know that yet. The spring of 1883 found Caldwell Creek fully alive, a real town with its own newspaper, a hotel with 4 rooms, a doctor's office, a church that held its congregation without straining at the walls, and a school that stood on its own foundations and bore a small carved sign above the door that read Hayes School, because the town council had voted to name it for its teacher and Ruth had argued against it and lost, which she found privately and entirely flattering. The railroad spur had brought commerce and correspondence, and a modest but genuine prosperity, and the families who had stayed through the hard years' war, that quiet pride of people who know they earned what they have. Monroe's ranch was one of the most efficient operations in the county. He had added a proper barn over the winter of 1882 and was experimenting with a new cattle breed better suited to the Kansas climate, corresponding with ranchers in Texas and reading journals from agricultural societies with the same focused curiosity he brought to novels. His 3 original hands had become 5, and Frank Harlow had brought a wife out from Missouri who became a firm friend to Ruth, a plain-spoken, cheerful woman named Bess who could make anything grow, and who planted a kitchen garden that made Ruth's own efforts look beginner, which they were, and who shared her knowledge with the generosity of someone who genuinely loved the work. It was Bess Harlow who told Ruth, over the shared labor of preserving the summer's harvest one September afternoon in 1883, that old Soto was not well. Ruth went to see him that evening. He lived in the bunkhouse on Monroe's property, as he had for 6 years, a small, quiet man with a life's worth of the open range in his weathered face. He was sitting up in his bunk when she came in, which he had clearly arranged specifically to demonstrate that he was fine, except that it was obvious he was not entirely fine. "Miss Ruth," he said, using the name he had always given her, which she had never corrected because it came from him as an expression of respect, not diminishment. "Soto," she said, "Monroe tells me you have been having trouble with your chest." "Old trouble," he said. "I have had it before." She sat on the stool beside his bunk and they talked for a while. She learned more of in that conversation than she had in 5 years of knowing him, a man who had spent 40 years on the cattle trails and roundups of the American Southwest, who had seen the open range change from something vast and ungoverned to something increasingly divided and fenced and owned. He spoke about this without bitterness, or rather with the resigned wisdom of someone who understands that the world does not consult you about its changes. He spoke about the life he had lived with a kind of satisfied plainness, not because it had been easy, but because it had been genuinely his, a life chosen day by day on the back of a horse under enormous skies. "This is a good ranch," he told her. "Monroe is a good man. The men are treated fair here." He looked at her with his permanently squinted eyes. "You were the best thing that happened to this town." "The railroad might argue that," Ruth said. "The railroad cannot teach children," Soto said. She laughed softly. "You take care of yourself," she said. "Dr. Peake's replacement is good. Let Monroe bring him to see you." Soto made the dignified equivocation of a man who has never liked doctors but will consider the matter. She counted it as a victory. Monroe brought the doctor the following morning, and Soto was given medicine and instructions, and a firm recommendation to rest, which he followed with extreme reluctance and the maximum dignity available to a man who has been told to lie down. He recovered over October and was back to half-pace work by November, which was the pace appropriate to a man of his age and experience, and which Monroe had arranged tactfully by redistributing tasks in a way that was obvious to everyone except apparently Soto. Ruth thought this was one of the most quietly kind things she had ever seen Monroe do. The winter of 1883 was their gentlest so far, or perhaps they had simply become so accustomed to the rhythms of the Kansas climate that its severity no longer registered as harshness, but as character. Henry, now 3½ and relentlessly curious, spent the winter asking questions at the rate of approximately 40 per hour, and extracting from Monroe detailed explanations of how everything from the water pump to the barn latch worked, which Monroe provided with the patience of a man who was genuinely pleased to be asked. Clara, at 2, was developing an expression of such focused consideration when she watched the world that it made Ruth and Monroe exchange glances of wondering speculation about what was happening behind those clear eyes. She had begun speaking in complete sentences considerably earlier than seemed warranted, and her first extended observation, delivered in the kitchen one December morning, was that the cat had knocked over the flour jar and was now sitting next to the mess looking at the ceiling. "That cat," Monroe said gravely, "has no integrity." Clara looked at him. "No tegrity," she agreed solemnly. Ruth had to leave the kitchen for a moment. The new year, 1884, arrived with a quiet New Year's gathering at the Granville store, which had been cleared of its merchandise shelves for the occasion, and decorated with cedar boughs and paper stars the schoolchildren had made. Ruth moved through the gathered community, talking and laughing, stopping to hear about the Miller family's new baby and the Granville boy Percy's announcement that he intended to read law, which everyone received with the kind of proud surprise that was completely genuine and completely earned. She found Monroe near the window at some point in the evening, standing apart from the main party with a glass of cider, and the observer's look he wore when he was watching something he found satisfying. He saw her coming and held out his free hand, and she took it and stood beside him. "Happy New Year," she said. "It is," he said. Outside the store window, the main street of Caldwell Creek was dusted with snow and lit by lanterns hung from the storefronts, and a group of children, Henry among them at the responsible elder end of the group, were chasing each other in figures of 8 in the snow with the unlimited energy of people who have not yet learned to conserve it. Clara, who had been permitted to stay up late as a special occasion, was sitting on Bess Harlow's knee near the stove, engaged in an involved conversation with a corn-husk doll that suggested she was not tired at all and did not intend to be. Ruth looked at all of it, the warm room and the people she had come to know and love in the way you love the people who are your daily life, deeply and specifically, and without the drama of novelty, the love that has burned down from its first bright high heat into something that produces warmth reliably and in all weathers. She looked at Monroe, her husband, the most surprising discovery of a year that had been built on surprising her. "I was thinking," she said, "about the fact that it has been almost 6 years since I rode into this town with nothing." "Almost 6 years since I watched you ride in," he said. She turned to look at him. "You remember that?" "I remember exactly," he said. "You came down the main street on a roan mare and you had the look of someone who had decided not to let the difficulty of things show on their face." "And what did you think?" she asked, though she knew something of the answer. "I thought," Monroe said, with the careful honesty that was his particular gift to her, "that whoever that was, she was someone worth knowing." Ruth looked at him for a long, full moment in the warm lamplight of the store, while the new year settled around them, and their children played and their community laughed, and outside the Kansas winter lay quiet and silver and permanently beautiful in its way. "You were right about that," she said. He smiled, the full unheld version that she had been the cause of more times than she could count now, and that still produced in her the same fundamental warmth it always had. And he lifted their joined hands and pressed his lips to her knuckles with a tenderness so complete, it required no further elaboration. Henry came charging through the door at that moment in a state of considerable snow-covered excitement, trailing 3 other children, and Clara slid off Bess Harlow's knee with the determined expression of a person who intends to be included, and the evening moved forward with the beautiful ordinary chaos of a real life, fully inhabited, fully loved. Caldwell Creek grew. The school grew. The Kendrick family grew, adding a 3rd child, a boy they named James, in the spring of 1885, who arrived with his father's dark hair and his mother's stubbornness, and an appetite that kept the whole household alert and cheerful and occasionally exhausted. Henry accepted his second brother with the worldly patience of a 5-year-old, who has already had one sibling and knows the protocol. Clara took one look at James and declared him hers, in much the way she had declared the cat hers the previous year, with the absolute certainty of someone who does not question their own sovereignty. Old Soto, who had never married and had no family that anyone knew about, became over these years a kind of honorary grandfather to the Kendrick children, a quiet presence who appeared on Sunday afternoons, and who could, under the right circumstances, be persuaded to tell stories of the old cattle trail days that left Henry with his eyes completely round and Clara asking tactical questions about the horses. The summer of 1886 brought a journalist from a Kansas City newspaper who was traveling through the territory writing about the recovery of frontier communities. He spent 2 days in Caldwell Creek, interviewing the Granvilles and Reverend Caldwell and the hotel proprietor, and he came to the school and sat in the back for an entire afternoon watching Ruth teach. He asked her afterward how she had come to be here, and she told him, the abbreviated version, the advertisement and the death of Mr. Holt and the empty town and the decision to stay. The journalist wrote in his notebook. He asked if she thought the school had made a difference to the town's recovery. The school gave the families a reason to stay, she said. People will endure a great deal of hardship if their children have a future in it. Take away the future and the present stops being worth the hardship. He wrote that down too. The article appeared in the Kansas City paper in August and mentioned Caldwell Creek favorably and specifically, citing the school and the supply store and the general determination of its residents. Monroe read it over breakfast without saying anything for a full minute. "You are in a newspaper," he said. "A sentence of mine is in a newspaper," Ruth said. "That is somewhat different." "You should be proud," he said. "I am," she said simply, and meant it about the school and the town and the work, and also, without saying so, about the life they had built together, which she was proud of in a way that ran entirely through her. The article brought 2 more inquiries to the town, a family considering relocation and a businessman interested in a potential commercial opportunity, both of which came to something. The town council, at Monroe's suggestion, began putting together a formal community document describing the town's resources and opportunities, essentially a prospectus for potential residents. And this was, Ruth thought, the most Monroe-Kendrick thing Monroe-Kendrick had ever done, organizing the future with the same careful thoroughness he brought to any building project. By the spring of 1887, Caldwell Creek was a genuinely functioning, growing community with 22 families, a newspaper of its own run by a determinedly opinionated young man named Webb, a proper hotel, a doctor, a lawyer, a school with 18 students, and a church that was about to begin construction on its first edition. It bore almost no resemblance to the half-boarded dying town Ruth had ridden into 9 years ago. Ruth was 35 years old and had lived more life in those 9 years than in the 26 that preceded them. She taught school and she loved her husband and she raised her children, and she was a complete and central person in the fabric of a community that she had helped to build. Some days, riding home from school in the late afternoon light, she passed the place on the main street where she had climbed down from her roan mare the first time, tired and broke and stubborn, and she felt the full arc of everything that had followed from that moment. One afternoon in May of that year, Henry, who was 7 and deeply interested in everything, asked her why she had come to Caldwell Creek. They were sitting on the porch after supper, Ruth shelling peas, Henry ostensibly helping but largely engaged in watching a beetle cross the porch boards. Monroe was in the yard with Clara and James, who were engaged in a project involving a large stick and a specific pile of dirt that appeared to have been assigned enormous significance. "I came because I needed a job," Ruth said honestly. Henry considered this. "And then you stayed. And then I stayed. Because of Papa," he said. "Because of many things," Ruth said. "Because of the school and the people and because the town needed what I could offer." She paused. "And yes, because of your father." Henry watched the beetle complete its crossing. "Papa says you were the best thing that happened to this town," he said, with the comfortable matter-of-factness of someone reporting a frequently heard statement. Ruth looked across the yard at Monroe, who had Clara on his back at this point in some kind of game, whose rules were entirely unclear to outside observers, and who had James by the hand. He caught her eye across the distance and held it for a moment with that look, the one she had known for 9 years now, warm and focused and entirely specific to her. "I think," Ruth said, watching her husband and her children in the last of the evening light while the Kansas sky went its extraordinary colors above them, that we were probably the best thing for each other. Henry, who was 7 and had a beetle to track, said okay and moved on. Ruth shelled her peas and watched her family and felt, as she did each day in different particular ways, the specific and irreducible happiness of a life that had grown from good soil into something real and lasting, something that would stand in this good flat Kansas country long after the difficulties that had brought her here were entirely forgotten, something built by two people who had recognized each other across a dusty street and a shared winter and a storm and an April ridge, and had chosen, each day since, to keep building. The cottonwoods along the creek were full out in their spring green. The evening star appeared above the darkening eastern sky. Somewhere down the main street of Caldwell Creek, a door opened and someone called a name, and a child's voice answered, running home. Monroe came up the porch steps with Clara still on his back and James trailing behind, and he looked at Ruth with the look she would carry with her the rest of her life, and she looked back. Home was not a place she had been given. It was a place she had found and stayed in and helped to make. She had stayed. That had been everything.